In episode 7, Ted goes to meet with Dr. Fieldstone for their first meeting, but he's nervous. He's talking way too much and not saying anything. He's extremely uncomfortable. It doesn't help, by the way, that Dr. Fieldstone isn't really saying much at all. She's just listening, which is in fact her job. After about 5 minutes of nonsense, Dr. Fieldstone finally asks, "Why don't you tell me about what happened the other night?" And Ted gets up and says, "Yeah, I don't want to talk about this," and runs out. He's not the only person, by the way, who's had a rough morning. Nate has been definitely reading the press clippings. He's been living on Twitter, and all of the reaction to his coaching has been positive. So he heads to his parents' house, hoping that maybe his dad would be proud of him. After all, he's on the front page of the sports side of the newspaper. But when he brings it up to his dad gives him a speech on being humble. So 2 of the 4 coaches have had a rough morning. They head out to practice where, during training, Ted lets the group know that it's really important to not let their opponents know how tired they are. They then break up into groups where Nate goes with the offensive players, and they're kind of razzing him a little bit about the whole Wonder Kid nickname that he gave himself in that post-game presser. And Nate takes it all in stride, except when Colin brings it up. And it's not like Colin said anything bad. All he said was, "We're lucky to be taught by the Wonder Kid today." But Nate takes such offense to it that he says, "All right, I need all our best goal scorers on the pitch. Actually, Colin, why don't you sit this one out?" And it really upsets Colin, who's been seeing Dr. Fieldstone about being more confident. And this certainly didn't help. After practice, the team heads into the locker room, and Sam immediately hops on banter. But the mystery woman that we now know as Rebecca has yet to reply, and he can't figure out why. And 3 dots do end up popping up on his screen, indicating that she might be texting back, but they stop. And Sam, along with the whole team who is watching this soap opera go down in front of them, are completely unaware that upstairs in the owner's office, Rebecca has no idea how to respond to this mystery man asking her to meet in person. Keely is imploring her just to respond, say yes. But Rebecca points out she just doesn't know what to say. And Higgins says, "Why don't you tell him the truth? I'd love to meet up, but I'm worried that you can't live up to the fantasy that I've created in my own head. So instead, I'll let my insecurities keep me from possibly meeting the love of my life." She's just really worried because every relationship she's had has just been a nightmare. She starts pointing out that Higgins' relationship is great and Keely and Roy is great, but Keely says not so fast. Roy is actually driving her nuts. They live together, and now they work together, and Keely just feels like she can't get any free time. Every time she turns around, there's Roy. And Roy even proves her point by walking into the office and asking her, "You ready to go?" That night, though, as Keely is trying to get some work done, Roy comes downstairs and starts trying to spend some time with her, but she explains, "You need to go on the couch and read your book because I have a lot of stuff to do." So that's exactly what Roy does. But the fact that he listened ends up turning her on so much that it ends up distracting her from her work because she jumps all over some Roy Kent. The next day, Ted Lasso starts his day in Dr. Fieldstone's office. She's a little surprised he came back, but he tells her, "I don't quit things." She senses that he's not a big fan of her profession, and he says, "No, I'm not." And he says, "Yeah, if you want the truth, I think your profession's bullshit. You don't know me. We don't have a history, and yet you expect me to spill my guts. But you're not listening because you care about me. You're listening because you're paid to. In fact, you're paid to be here for an hour, yet the session's only 50 minutes. So how much could you really care? And all of this so you can what? Blame it on my folks? Like I said, it's bullshit." Then he stands up and walks out for the second time. He goes downstairs to get ready for practice that day. But most of the people at FC Richmond have their heads buried in their phones. Nate is once again reading press clippings, while Sam and Rebecca are waiting for the other to respond, having no idea who they're actually talking to. And they end up ironically bumping into each other. They end up having a little bit of an awkward hello and then go their separate ways. Colin, however, wants to get some answers on what went down yesterday. He goes into Nate's office and asks, "Did I do something to upset you?" He can't figure out why Danny and Jamie said basically the same comments that he said, but Nate wasn't mad at Danny or Jamie. He was only mad at him. And Nate gives the most arrogant explanation on why he did what he did. He tells Colin that Danny and Jamie are like Picasso, whereas Colin is like that painting at a Motel 6. It's just kind of there. It's a painting made to cover up a bloodstain. And that painting does the job, but its job isn't to be beautiful art, it's to cover up things like bloodstains. So he tells Colin, just do the job. It's a really douchey response, and it's one that Beard overhears. And while Nate was insulting Colin, the rest of the figureheads of FC Richmond, being Higgins, Ted, Rebecca, Keely, are meeting in the equipment room. It's the only place that Keely feels like she can get a break from Roy, and also smoke. All of a sudden, Jamie shows up, and it gets really awkward when they're actually talking about Roy, and Roy enters the room. Although he actually guesses that they're talking about him, he doesn't really care though, asking Keely, "All right, you ready to go?" That night, though, the fact that Keely can't get any alone time bottles up and she explodes on Roy and she's trying to watch Sex and the City. She explains that sometimes she just needs to be by herself. And Roy is more upset by the fact that he just realized this is what Keely's been talking to everybody about this entire time. He thought before she was just complaining about how much hair he left in the drain. But now, he's pissed, and he ends up leaving. When Roy gets to the training facility the next day, Keely's waiting for him, but he completely blows her off. When Nate gets to the training facility the next day, he's listening to a podcast talk about how wise and smart he is, but when he gets in his office, Beard is waiting for him. He tells him that he was rude to Colin, and it was weird and personal. And he hasn't told Ted, this is just between the two, but he demands that Nate do better. And Beard actually can't tell Ted, because Ted, for the third straight day, has gone up to Dr. Fieldstone's office before practice for a therapy session. Although this time, she expected him, because after all, Ted Lasso doesn't quit stuff. But even though Dr. Fieldstone is paid to listen, she has something to say to Ted. She tells him that she was completely offended by what he said, asking him, "Would you coach for free?" And Ted says, "Yeah, I would." But she asks, "Do you?" And Ted has to admit, "No, I don't." Her point is, just because she gets paid to do what she does doesn't mean that she doesn't care about her patients. Just because he gets paid to coach doesn't mean he doesn't care about his players. The fact that he would assume that it's not the same for her is what really offends her. And Ted ends up apologizing. She forgives him, telling him that fight or flight response is natural. It just so happens that Ted Lasso does both. But Ted ends up saying, "So you think I'm scared?" And she says, "Yes, I do." And Ted says, "Maybe I just don't want to learn the truth." But Dr. Fieldstone points out the truth will set you free. They then end up going through their first therapy session, but we don't actually know what they talked about. Afterwards, though, it seems like Ted does feel better. He comes out chipper, but, that's kind of just normal Ted Lasso. But before they break up into groups, Nate ends up going and apologizing to Colin. All of this, by the way, is something that Ted had no idea about, and he asks Beard if he has to address it, but Beard assures him, "No, we're good." The groups then break up into practice, and they're going through a drill, and Roy ends up screaming at Jamie, saying, "What the hell are you doing? You're supposed to back up your partner." But Jamie points out that Roy's wrong. What the teammate needed in that moment was space. And because it's a soccer analogy, Roy ends up realizing that, he needs to give Keely space. Of course, the team has no idea about this. They just think that Roy Kent's being Roy Kent. But Roy Kent has had a breakthrough. That night, when Keely comes home, Roy has a bath ready for her, candles, music, and he lets her know, "I won't bother you for 3 hours." After practice, the team head in the locker room, and it's a good thing that Nate apologized because the team had made him a personalized jersey, and it would have been awkward if he was still being a dick. And the jersey has number 1, Wonder Kid. Nate loves it, and the team lets him know that it was actually Will's idea. He just thought it was a really cool nickname. Nate thanks everybody and then heads into his office, where he once again hops on Twitter, scrolling, reading all the positivity. But Twitter is a cesspool. Trust me, I can attest to that. There's always somebody out there waiting to tell you that you're a lib cuck soy boy, even though you've never had soy in your life. I'm looking at you, DanMan45. Yeah, I reported your ass to Twitter. Anyway, the point is, there's always somebody ready to just bring you down. And when Nate sees the dark side of Twitter, it pisses him off. He ends up storming into Will's office, throwing the jersey at him and saying, "Don't you ever embarrass me like that again." And then finally, Ted Lasso ends his night in the pub, but he ends up running into Trent Krim from The Independent. And this is the first time Trent has been able to talk to Ted since he walked off the pitch with, quote, food poisoning. So he asks Ted for a quote, but the quote that Ted gives him is the company line. "Sorry, Trent, I had food poisoning." And Trent writes it down, files it away for later, and heads out. Thank you so much for checking out this recap. Please consider subscribing to the channel. Hit thumbs up if you liked it. Smash that thumbs down button if you thought this sucked. Make sure to be nice in the comment section. If you don't see the next video up in the end screen there, I'll get it up in a few days, not to worry. And I have merchandise, so go buy a mug or something. It's never too early to think about Christmas gifts, folks. But once again, thank you for checking out this recap.